And I think even though a lot of people feel potentially apprehensive about it, it's a little bit more of a prepared apprehension, kind of like a planned surgery versus an emergency surgery.
What would happen if we just told the truth?
Welcome to Truth Works, where we dig into the nitty-gritty of leadership and work.
And what needs to change? I'm Jessica Neal.
And I'm Patty McCord.
Our journey together started in HR, but trust us, it's evolved into something wild, honest, and well, a bit rebellious.
So throw out the handbook. We're here to redefine rules to work for us, not against us.
Let's dive into another episode. Okay, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Truth Works. Patty's joining today. She's back, so I'm so excited to have her back.
Yay.
We've done a few episodes without her, but we've missed you, and we're so happy you're here. We're also happy to have this amazing guest with us today, Sharon McMahon. What I love about Sharon is this story. So, you spent years of your life in government, history, and law, and then you kind of took your passion to educating, and you went on Instagram and you started to get all these followers, and I guess you became America's, what do they call you? America's government teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And you have governors that follow you, which, by the way, I think is so important because I feel like a lot of folks don't understand how it all works.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very glad that you are educating folks on all the things.
Mm-hmm.
And your book is out now. It's an amazing book with amazing stories about amazing people. It's The Small and Mighty, 12 Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. But introduce yourself to our listeners. We're so excited to have you and talk about all the things government and work.
Thanks so much for having me. As you mentioned, I'm Sharon McMahon, the author of the brand new book, The Small and the Mighty. I also write a newsletter called The Preamble. You can find that at thepreamble.com. And I, as you mentioned, have been a government and law teacher for most of my adult life and now just teach on a different platform. Instead of in a high school classroom, I teach people on the internet. I host a podcast just like you do called Here's Where It Gets Interesting. And it's a very, very busy life. But before I started doing what I'm doing now, I have actually owned multiple small businesses. And so I actually really love talking about business and love talking about work. So I'm excited to be able to glean wisdom from both of you.
Sharon, I have to share something. I wanted to be a teacher. That was my whole purpose of living until I got into business. And I got into business because it paid 3 times as much as a teacher, and I was 30 years old. And my teacher friends always gave me shit about it, right? They were like, oh, you gave up your passion. And one time I was sitting in an executive offsite and we were writing about, the cliches, right? What would you tell your 20-something-year-old self, or what did you want to be? And I realized, oh, wait a minute, they're just taller. We're just not sitting on little chairs anymore. I was actually spending my life teaching. And I think for those of us who that's our proclivity, we can't help it. That's why I'm doing the podcast too, right?
That's right.
I can't help myself.
It.
And
I
understand. Once you get the reputation, then it's like the reason Jessica and I keep saying I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to quit. And then it's like, but no, they need to learn. And so that's what we want to do here today is really learn from you and teach both of our listeners about how to think about this very fraught situation we're in. I wanted to also mention that the day today that we're recording our podcast, the VP debate is tonight. So we are literally smack in the middle of U.S. politics. So, let us wallow.
Yes. Well, before we wallow, because I think that's going to be where a lot of the conversation goes, I just want our listeners to know about when you decided to do the Instagram thing and what made you do that? Like, what was the motivation?
Why, girl? Why?
Yeah, well, it was September of 2020, and the world was seemingly in a tailspin, right? We were at the height of a global pandemic. There had not been like treatments or vaccines invented yet, and it seemed like everything was going to hell in a handbasket. And then coming up in, 5 weeks' time, we had a very, very contentious presidential election.
Yeah.
No matter who you were voting for in that election, I don't think anybody looks back on that election as like, let's do that again. That was great, right? Like no one thinks that was great and fun and we should have a repeat. So, that was the backdrop against which all of this started. And I, of course, like almost everybody, noticed a tremendous amount of misinformation floating around on the interwebs, on Al Gore's internet. And there was one sort of specific moment where I had there was a guy in the comments section on Facebook on one of my friends' posts talking about how the Electoral College was like a place you could graduate from, like a building near the White House that you could go to. And I was like, but see, that's not real. Okay, that's not even a matter of opinion.
That's right. I'm a graduate of the Electoral College.
Right, exactly. Right, like you have a bachelor's from the Electoral College. No, you don't.
Right.
No, you don't. It's a concept, not a place. So, like that's not a matter of opinion, right? Like that's not who to vote for or which person's a better candidate. That's just wrong. That's just you're just being confidently wrong on the internet, Chad. That's what's happening right now. So there were a lot of people being confidently wrong on the internet. I decided sort of in that moment, I could either reply back to Chad and be like, actually, the Electoral College is a concept, not a place. Or I could make like a little short, nonpartisan, fact-based explainer video about how the Electoral College works and how it's not a place, it's a concept. And then maybe my friend could just sort of like drop that in the comments and Chad could watch it. Or, maybe that video would have more longevity. Maybe it would have like, it would have a life beyond that one Facebook post. So that's really the moment I decided to try something that had not been done before. And honestly, business is full of these kind of stories, and so is history of just normal people who had normal lives who just decided, I'm going to do something that other people have not done in a different way than other people have done it. And they just decided to try.
It's totally it's our mission from God to kind of do the same kind of thing about work, right? Like, that people don't go behind the curtain and drink a potion and there's magic and that's how you get paid. Right.
That's right. There is no like Glinda the Good Witch who taps you on the head with a star wand and is like, you're the one, you're chosen. I think so many people feel like they're waiting to be chosen by some entity, by some person. No, people just started doing stuff.
I use the wand metaphor all the time about empowerment. I always say that, it's a word that I hate where it's like you have a magic wand, like you're empowered.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
There you go. So then you start doing this and then it just kind of takes off and gets a life of its own.
Yeah. I mean, what ended up happening?
Were you expecting that?
No, of course not. No.
Yeah.
What ended up happening was, I quickly discovered that there was a local news and radio demand for what I was doing. So if you are, like an NBC affiliate in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you cannot afford to alienate half of your viewing audience by having a guest on that it really believes candidate A should be elected or candidate B should be elected, giving you sort of this political commentary. The big cable channels can afford to have their sort of ideological bents, right? But these local news markets cannot. They cannot alienate half of their listening audience. So I started getting tons of requests in quite short order, just from people who had watched my videos and started sending in my name for radio stations and TV stations all over the country. And as I started doing like more and more appearances, just talking about what to expect with the upcoming election, how the actual Electoral College was going to play out, all of those sorts of things. Because I was just explaining it from a fact-based perspective and not from a perspective of this candidate is the smart one and this one is a jerk, it just became this like sort of snowball effect. And then, of course, the election was extremely contentious. And then we had, January 6th and all of these ensuing events that created a lot of confusion in the United States. And people apparently needed somewhere to go that could give them just like the straight information that they were looking for. And that for some people, that ended up being my account.
Do you feel like in this selection, we're more confused than we were or less confused?
I think less confused overall because the last election, there were so many unknowns, coupling the pandemic with everything else.
Yeah.
There were a lot of like first times for many things. This time, I think people are a little bit better prepared for what to expect. They know, for example, that there are going to probably be many lawsuits leading up to the election and immediately following the election. People know this go round, that it's unlikely that the winner of the election will be determined on election night. That it's going to take a period of time and that there's going to be, probably recounts in multiple places. I think overall people are more attuned to the idea that like, okay, presidential elections have changed in the United States, at least for now. That's not to say the pendulum won't swing farther, but for now, this is where we are. And I think even though a lot of people feel potentially apprehensive about it, it's a little bit more of a prepared apprehension, kind of like a planned surgery versus an emergency surgery.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
That's right. But it's not a facelift. It's like a gallbladder. Right?
Yeah, it's like a repeat C-section as opposed to an emergency C-section.
Okay.
Yeah, which those aren't great either, but having had one.
Yeah.
But okay, so Instagram takes off, and then are you writing the book at the same time, or when did you start writing the book?
Yeah, I started writing the book about a year into this process, or a year after starting my account is when I finally signed the contracts and started writing the book. But the process started, even before then, in terms of finding an agent, having agents and publishers starting to approach me. So, but the actual sort of stamps and signs were all done, roughly September of 2021. So about a year later. And yeah, it took me 3 years to write and research and publish this book. And, it's really been a labor of love. I wrote it for the reader. I wrote it for other people. It's not because I can't think of something else to do with my time. It's not because I don't have hobbies or 4 children or a job. You know what I mean? It's not like, oh, what will I do today? I don't know.
I love it. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yes, I wrote it really as, sort of a love letter to the reader. So it took me 3 years to write it, but that was what I was thinking while I was writing it.
And then how did you find the stories of these beautiful people? And did you have the concept that that's what you wanted to do, or were you inspired by someone you met? How did that all come about?
Yeah, I have I have a private Instagram account and a book club that I run, and I discovered that many of the most popular pieces of content that I create for that group were stories like these. They're sort of deep dives into something that somebody did, or a deep dive into sort of a biography of an unknown person that people really, really resonated with, and they just kept telling me that they come back and they reread these and they love them and they mean something to them. So I had ideated around other potential book topics. I had played around with well, what if I do this or what if I do that? And ultimately, I just kept coming back to this idea of I know the reader will love this.
Yeah, and real stories are so powerful. I mean, I was just listening to you this morning, and it might have been something you did in the last couple of days, was about, these were average folks, right, who made
normal
a difference.
People.
And you can too. Right. And I know that one of the things that for Jessica and I in the work world was to constantly try and create an environment where the sort of unsung heroes could matter too. Right. Because for me, when I came up in the world of work, it was the star, the amazing, I think of all this stuff about Elon now, because everybody, are you going to emulate him or are you not? Because one guy can rule the world. I mean, I actually interviewed with Gwen Shotwell, who runs SpaceX. Elon doesn't run SpaceX. Gwen does. So yeah, had you been teaching about these particular individuals anyway in your classes, or were they just people you stumbled across and thought, that's such a good story, I should tell it?
A couple of the people were on my radar already. I had done smaller pieces of content about a couple of the people where I was like, I just really love their story, but I had just sort of barely scratched the surface of it. And so I spent a lot more time researching them and really fleshing out their stories and contextualizing them in their place in history. So a few of them I was familiar with before, but a handful of them were brand new to me. And I discovered, I sort of stumbled upon them. This is how a lot of history writers work, it almost feels like the wand chooses the wizard in Harry Potter, It feels a little bit like the stories choose you in that you happen upon them at the right moment, in the right place, in the right time. I was going down some rabbit hole and, like a name would catch my eye and I'd be like, I'm going to come back to that person. I'd write them down and then I'd look into them more later. Yeah, most of them I came upon somewhat by chance. Although, it was hard work that put me in the right place at the right time to be able to have that chance. But yeah.
So without spoiler alerting, about the whole book, but tell us a tidbit about one of, because I'm sure all the people in the book are your favorites, but tell us one of the stories that you think will entice some of our listeners.
Well, because this is a podcast that talks a lot about work, I'll tell you about somebody who had some important work in the book, and that is a man named Julius Rosenwald. Are either of you familiar with him? Do you know who he is? Okay. So Julius Rosenwald is this man who is the child of immigrants, like many people at the turn of the 20th century. He actually was born in Illinois, just down the street from where the Lincoln family lived. His family was friends with the Lincoln family while Abraham Lincoln was young. So that's, ultimately doesn't become part of his story. It's just kind of like an interesting connection. But he, as a teenager, leaves school and begins to intern at his uncle's clothing business. And then eventually starts his own sort of little suit company. And Sears Roebuck and Company begins buying suits from this man named Julius Rosenwald. And he makes suits for the summer and suits for the winter. And, men of certain status were expected to wear suits out of the house. And then one day, his brother-in-law comes to him and says, "Are you interested in an investment?" And he's like, "Well, what kind of an investment?" And it turns out that his brother-in-law was asking him if he was interested in investing in Sears Roebuck and Company. And the reason that he was asking him this is because Richard Sears, who was one of the founders of Sears, had a lot of good ideas and a lot of skills, but organization and logistics were not one of them. He was a great writer. He was really good at writing copy for his catalogs in a way that converted people like crazy. He was amazing at conversions, but he had no concept of how to have warehouses full of merchandise that then needs to be shipped out by train to all of these people around many of them in rural areas. And the cash flow was a huge problem for him. So Julius Rosenwald is like, well, Sears owes me money anyway, because he had been shipping them suits that they had not sort of been paying him for. It's like, well, they owe me money anyway, so we can fix this situation.
Work something out.
We can work something out here. So he makes an investment of $37,500 into Sears Roebuck and Co. And long story short, he eventually becomes the president of Sears. Julius Rosenwald does. And he becomes, by his own description, came into this vast personal fortune by luck and proximity. Certainly did not come from anything above sort of a middle-class family, only got the opportunity to buy into the company just because of this one just sort of opportunity lands in his lap, right? But here's the remarkable thing. It's not that he becomes the president of Sears. He is the modern day equivalent, by the way, of a billionaire. If you take the money and you adjust it for inflation, he's a billionaire. He has everything you could ever want, right? His children all have the finest educations. He has a beautiful home. They go on vacation. His wife has the furs. He has everything you could ever want. And I'll save some of the story for the book because it is a really interesting story how he makes this happen. But he decides for his 50th birthday that he's going to start making some large financial bequests. He's going to start giving his money away as sort of a celebratory 50th birthday present. And by the end of his journey, which is long, the end of his journey giving away his money, he has given away over $1 billion. And he has started 5,000 schools in the United States. 5,000 schools, primarily for African American students in the rural South.
Wow.
And the idea that someone today who is a billionaire would start 5,000 schools, first of all, nobody's doing that anymore, right? That's not a thing that anyone's doing. Today, the people with billions of dollars are blasting off into space in weirdly shaped rockets. They are buying themselves super yachts. And some of them do have some great philanthropic work. But Julius Rosenwald decides, I want to get rid of all of my money by the time I'm gone. Yeah. And so he sets a little bit of the money aside to live on in his old age and has instructions that my money needs to be given away within a certain number of years after my death. And the impact of what he chooses to do with this money that he came by, as he says, by, luck and happenstance, the impacts of that choice of giving away $1 billion directly to 1- and 2-room schools all over the South. At one point, over 90% of African American students in the state of Alabama were going to a school that he funded. The lasting repercussions of his choice are still being felt by Americans today. With people like John Lewis, for example, went to a school that he was funded by. People like Toni Morrison went to a school that he funded. We are still to this day, as the descendants and the beneficiaries of the people who were able to receive an education, we're still feeling the effects of his choices today. And also the story of how he gets to be the president of Sears, Roebuck & Co. is also a very interesting one. And how Sears actually gets started is very interesting.
Yeah. What a special guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To have, a 50th birthday and to have such selflessness and to want to give away and help others. To your point, I wish there were more people like that. We know a few, but there's not enough, which kind of leads me to the next topic we wanted to talk to you about, which is this hatred and people not being able to be nice to each other and talking about politics. And there's a choice there too that people are making. I lived this at Netflix, the election that you were speaking about, and helping navigate our employees through that. Also, the election before that was contentious as well, and for some people, for some not, because their person did or didn't win, which happens in election. Either your person's going to win or they're not going to win.
Right.
And, that's just how it goes. And I think at work, it was so complicated because, of course, people wanted to talk about it, but they couldn't, right? Even to there were a group of employees and they were talking about what they did over the weekend. And one of them said they took their son hunting. And then the other two employees were like, you have a gun, and how, just went quite frankly overboard on this poor guy who was just trying to say,
here's what I did over the weekend. Yeah.
Took his son hunting. I was leading a session with our most senior leaders in the company, and it was a session on inclusion. I told them that because I'm a Democrat, but I said, and hey, my husband is a Republican and I still love him. And the room was like, oh, your husband's a Republican. But it was very, very tricky to navigate.
Totally. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
To the point where, the company leaned more liberal, but we certainly had many conservative folks within the organization. However, they probably wouldn't admit that they were, right? And you almost didn't want them to talk about it because it was such a distraction from what we were supposed to be doing, which was work. But it is, life and work and everything just blends together these days. I think these things could also travel to the Thanksgiving dinner table
Yep.
this year, which will be an interesting Thanksgiving this year because we will then know who our new president is. So what's your advice for leaders at work, for navigating this, for employees at work? Do you talk about it?
And side note, for confronting non-factual perspectives.
Yeah, that's really tricky at work, isn't it? It's really tricky to be able to say, actually, Bob, that's not
Chad.
the moon is not made of green cheese.
Yeah.
So stop saying that in the break room.
Yeah.
You know, like that's a really tricky thing to do because once you start fact checking one employee, then they're going to start bringing up, well, you never fact checked Sandy. Sandy said blah, blah, blah. Do you know what I mean? It becomes a very slippery slope when it comes to fact checking some people and not other people. So in terms of like how to navigate a contentious election season at work, you know, there's a couple of different tactics, and I wouldn't say there's one specific answer that I would give every single company. Every company has their own culture. Some people have, such a large and diverse workforce that it makes sense to not infiltrate the company with, your politics. Other companies are built on this sort of certain type of ethos, right? I'm thinking about like a Patagonia type company where they're very upfront about, what our beliefs at this company are. And, if you want to work here, then you have to be okay with that. Right?
Yeah, like Chick-fil-A, In-N-Out.
I was just going to say the same thing, right?
Hobby Lobby.
Hobby Lobby, yeah.
Right. So there's just sort of these, kind of different camps of how businesses might approach talking about politics or thinking about politics. And I'm not going to go out and say, well, everybody should follow this one edict. But regardless of what your business's viewpoint is, I think it is incumbent upon leaders at work to make sure that people are able to focus on the job at hand and not be distracted by an environment that makes them feel unwelcome. Right? If I'm thinking about this from a classroom perspective as a classroom teacher, it is my job to provide a safe learning environment for everyone in that classroom. It's not my job to make sure all my students agree. That's a different thing than providing a safe learning environment.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I was thinking about the things that, the skills that all of us need to get better at doing. But a skill that I took from the classroom to the workplace was teaching people how to say, I hear you. And that's all. Right? And you might want to save those vicious arguments for a place other than the break room.
Yeah.
But where's the space to speak and be heard? And the safety is really important. I think you're really right on there.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I always, when navigating this at Netflix, and we had over 10,000 people around the world. And, there wasn't just elections in the United States that were contentious. There were elections in Brazil that were contentious and, Argentina and, you name it. And there's also a push from employees on both sides for an employer to take a stance and for an employer to say something about what's going on politically. And I just learned, to your point, that for me, we're not about sides. We're not about one versus the other. And we're just not going to comment on any of it. Right. Now, if there's something that happens, like, and there's, unrest in the region and there's danger to employees, it's a different story than backing a candidate. Right. Which ostracizes half of your employee base. Right. And so, that I think I see some companies choose not to do that. And I think, it can cause a place to be unsafe. Right. And And then, one side feels more supported than the other. And then the other either leaves or just is quiet and doesn't say a word. And I think that that's, sad.
And it's why the work you're doing is so important
Mm-hmm.
to teach people. I mean, there's so many similarities in what you're doing around politics and government to what we did and do still around work. It's like, you can like it or not. Here's how it functions.
Yeah.
Right. Here's how it occurs. Right. And so understand the mechanics of what we're dealing with here. Then you go wherever you want with it. But you have to like the Electoral College is such a perfect example. And, and to be fair, I'm thinking about on the news right now, our former CEO, chairman of the board, there's a whole bunch of stuff about people are quitting Netflix because he made a donation to the Harris campaign, right? And so, it was as a individual, and yet when you have the spotlight, everything that you do takes on a different perspective. So,
it does.
I mean, I think it's something, and back to how your story of how you created your space in the world, the world of the internet changes everything, right? So there's the talks that we have together, and then the talks that we have online, and what we read and who we trust is a much bigger universe than it used to be. So how do you manage that as you decide which subjects to talk about or what things to educate people about?
Yeah, because I can't talk about everything, right? And just like every company, unlike Sears, which now actually maybe this is a great example.
Yeah.
No company can do everything. And that's you're actually failing in your mission if you are trying to be all things to all people.
Yep. And I think we found that out the last 5-10 years, right?
You're failing in your mission if you're trying to be all things to all people. It is okay for you to have certain things that as a company you strongly care about. Like there are some companies that donate a portion of their proceeds to rainforest, rehabilitation or, whatever. It is okay to have issues that are really near and dear to your company's heart. The United Way or children's cancer or whatever it is. Allowing your employees the opportunity to feel like this company cares and is giving back without wading into really potentially super fraught waters of, well, we care because we're voting for Harris, or vice versa at this company. Right. So I think that, one of the important things to keep in mind is that companies can encourage civic engagement without taking a position on a candidate. And I like to think about a couple of studies that have been done about one of the most effective ways to improve voter turnout is by making voting a priority at work. And not saying be sure to vote for candidate X or Y, but by giving people paid time off during the day to leave, by prominently posting voting rules in the local jurisdictions. The polls close at 8. Here's how to find where you go. Here's how to get an absentee ballot. The studies go so far as to show that when somebody in the organization is appointed to be sort of like the voting coordinator, and it's their job to disseminate accurate voting information to their employees and to continually sort of blink the message that we care about your ability to participate in democracy, that actually increases voter turnout more than it's one of the most effective ways if it becomes part of your company culture that civic participation in whatever form that takes, either voting or participating in a nonprofit group or whatever, that is one of the most effective ways to engage the citizenry. And I'd love to see more companies step up to caring about the concept of a nonpartisan viewpoint on just voting. Not who to vote for.
Yeah, we did a little bit of that at Netflix, and not that we hired somebody to be the coordinator. Maybe we should have, but we did make it clear that you had this time and that we wanted you to take it. And we didn't, we didn't say one way or another, but it's like, you have to take this day off, like go figure it out. This is, we want you to participate in something, for our country and for our democracy.
That's really good advice, though. It's really practical. I mean, that's one of the things I like about what you talk about is just straightforward and practical. Okay, vote however you want, but vote, right? And you don't have to choose between your job and participating in democracy. I think that's a great message.
Some companies have gone so far as to specifically, closing for half a day or closing for a couple of hours instead of saying, hey, if you want to take time off to vote, go ahead. Instead of that being like,
nobody else is, but go ahead.
Exactly. Right. We're closing at 3 today so that everybody can use their time to vote. And that sends a really clear message about how much you value it.
Yeah. So I have a question, and this is, less about work, maybe more personal, but how do you navigate these conversations? I guess, being in a marriage where, my husband is a Republican and I am a Democrat, we don't agree on the views. I try to stay respectful of his. I think he tries to stay respectful of mine. But I don't know, there seems to be like this, if you're with me, you're right. If you're not with me, you're wrong. And then there's just a lot of meanness that happens from that. And I think, that has happened at work. It happens in families. It happens in relationships. How do you get out of the meanness?
Yeah, it's a very legitimate concern, not just for companies, but for people with their interpersonal relationships. Like you were saying earlier, like it spills over into Thanksgiving dinner. It spills over into like, oh, I don't want to have him come over this weekend. No.
Yep.
Like it does. It impacts us when people are unable to have civil conversations. And in the past, thinking back to say like the post-World War II era, the 1950s-ish, it became sort of taboo to talk about politics and religion with your neighbors. Like those are not polite topics. You don't go over to somebody's house and say, "Are you Republican?" Yeah, that was not something that was acceptable to do. And times have changed from that, right? This idea of don't talk about it because it's taboo to talk about, that times have moved on from that. Many people feel like their political identity is a very important part of their personal identity. And to ask them to not talk about politics is like saying, don't talk about my husband or wife, that's not okay with me. So in terms of how to navigate sort of the meanness that happens in interpersonal relationships or at work, I think reframing this idea or reframing your interactions from the perspective of, I need to convince you that my way is the right way, instead of approaching it with the like, how can I convert you to my way of thinking, which is often our default position. That's kind of the human default.
Yep.
Approaching the interaction from the perspective of, what can I learn from you? And the idea that like, what can I learn from you gives up this notion of conversion to your way of thinking and opens a chance for a far more respectful dialogue that doesn't ultimately require you to agree at the end. It doesn't mean, Jessica, that you will be a Republican at the end of this conversation with your husband or vice versa. But it does allow you to learn something from somebody with whom you're interacting. Now, what you might learn is something that disturbs you. You might learn something you wish you didn't know. But nevertheless, there is, even if you learn information that you strongly disagree with, that's still useful information. That's still something that you can use to better understand a certain side or a certain position, or like where a customer's coming from or where coworkers coming from. There's a huge potential to learn. And as soon as we begin to believe that we alone have a lock on the truth, that our understanding of the world is the only correct understanding of the world. That's a type of what I call moral narcissism, that I am the purveyor of the correct opinions. And if your opinion does not match my opinion, then you violate my morals and you are beneath me. And it's a very narcissistic way of viewing the world, that I alone have the correct opinions and you need to fall in line with mine. It requires a certain amount of humility to be willing to learn from somebody you disagree with.
Yeah, it's back to those great listening skills. I mean, one of my favorite phrases in the world is, what leads you to believe that is true? And
I'd love to hear more about how you came to believe that.
And then you find out, oh, well, maybe I should look into that because that's
hadn't thought of that.
Not my understanding of
Yeah.
that particular situation. I mean, and the other thing about these things that you just said is those are all truisms for any kind of disagreement.
Yep. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
For any kind of, that's why we talk about truth at work, which is what's your truth? Where does it come from? How do you think about that? Help me understand where you're coming from so that now at least I know that, right? At least I can navigate from a point of understanding rather than a point of proving you wrong.
Right.
I have a phrase that I love when I'm dealing with people who I know are very diametrically opposed to like my own views. And I also feel like Thanksgiving is not the time for me, at least, to like hash out all the politics of the world. Our chances to be together as a family are very limited, right? And I don't want to get to the end of my life or their life and be like, glad we spent all that time arguing. So one of my favorite phrases, which is kind of disarms people when they're trying to sort of press your buttons. And we all know somebody in our lives who likes to press our buttons, right? Who knows that like we're annoyed when you say that thing. And so they like to say that thing. So you get more annoyed. My favorite phrase, in addition to I hear you or I'd love to hear more about how you came to believe that. My other favorite phrase is some people love it. Some people love it. Or some people love him. Some people love her. When people are like, can you believe?
I'm stealing that one.
Yes.
It's a really, yeah.
Can you believe that such and such did blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
You know,
Some
like there's
people
always
love 'em.
somebody. You know what? Some people love her.
Yeah.
You're not taking a position on it. You're not getting into it. You're kind of just signaling to like, yeah, I heard what you said. I get it.
Yep.
But you're not necessarily, you're not signaling, I want to just further this discussion by providing counterpoints. And you know what? Some people love it.
Yeah.
It's actually a super useful tool.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I was just thinking, okay, so at Thanksgiving, we'll know the winner by then. What's your advice for people whose person lost?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's going to feel bad.
Right.
It's going to feel bad. If you are the person, if you're on team whatever, and that team loses the election and you're sitting around Thanksgiving dinner and you're feeling real bitter about the fact that your team lost, I understand that it can be a lot to ask, but I do think it's always sage advice to treat other people the way you would want to be treated. Right? That if you want somebody to be respectful of your beliefs, now is not the time to start bringing up all the things that are wrong with their candidate who just won. Like that can be something we can talk about another day. And I think it behooves us, and we've sort of moved away from this in this country, to remember that at the end of our lives, we are not going to have regrets about like, oh man, I wish I had gotten in some more sick burns in the comments section. Right? Like
neener.
Yeah, that's not the regret. The regret is not like, oh my God, I wish I had told her to stuff it on Thanksgiving when my candidate lost.
That's right.
Right? You're not going to regret that.
No.
But this too shall pass. And you're better off maintaining your relationships than you are. And again, I'm talking about non-abusive relationships. I'm not saying stay in a domestic violence situation, nothing like that. But you know what I'm saying? That ultimately, the way that you might be able to impact somebody to change in the future, let's say you think the candidate they voted for is terrible and heading the country in the wrong direction. The way you might be able to change their view in the future is by maintaining a warm relationship with them. Because we are most influenced by the people with whom we have a warm relationship. It's why we call our friends to ask for advice. It's why we call our friends, we tell our friends, like, I just bought the world's best vacuum cleaner. You need to get it. It's so great. It's so wonderful. You believe what your friend says over nearly everybody else. You actually do have a tremendous amount of influence over people in your immediate sphere. And if you cut that person off and you torch the relationship, you lose the ability to impact them positively in the future. So to me, that's always something that has to be weighed against a momentary desire to gloat or to, deflate somebody else's high.
Well, that's another good question. What about for the people whose person won and gloating you just mentioned? What's your advice to those folks?
I just think look with compassion at the people who are in a situation you would not want to be in. Right? If your candidate wins and you're feeling good about it, it's fine for you to feel good about it. Feel good about it in the car on the way home. Right? Feel good about it all night and all day, and have some compassion for the people who are feeling differently in that moment, just like you would with another circumstance where you got a promotion and the other person didn't. Is it the right thing to do at that moment to be like, I got the promotion and you didn't? Sucks to be you.
Yeah.
Like, is that the right moment to have that conversation? No.
No.
You would act with compassion towards a person who's deeply disappointed about something. And, maybe change the topic. That's another, in addition to some people love him or her or it, I also love the concept of like, yeah, you know what, man, that was pretty crazy, right? I did bring pie though.
I was going to say, and sweet potatoes are good too.
Yeah. Yep. Can I interest you in this? Like the pivot to another topic.
Yeah.
And for some people who have social anxiety and worry about like, how will I make this pivot? Just think of a couple of pivots in advance.
Yeah.
Think about like, what are some topics? Are you guys doing a family vacation this Christmas?
Right.
Tell me more about your trip to Greece. Think of a couple things in advance if you're somebody who has a difficult time, like pivoting in the moment, so that you just sort of have those tucked in your pocket.
Particularly at Thanksgiving, because it's probably family or friends.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have that in common. I have to make one. My sister just passed, and my sister got very involved in politics at the end of her life. She was determined. We went to the Women's March together, and she decided, by God, she's going to be in politics. And at her memorial, at her service, were all these people that she had convinced to be involved in her party. And what they said that I really have learned a lot from was, your sister taught me how to care about my community first. And I learned that I can make a difference in my community. And so what I learned from her and what she learned was that listening was really important, because she was doing her politics in a place in the world where people didn't necessarily agree with her, but they agreed with what was wrong. Right. And they agreed with what they could do better in their own town, in their own community. They agreed with, better water and cleaner air and the things. And so what I learned from her is that we all want to rally around the real things that matter. And so we have that in common. So
Me too.
that's
I love that.
my Mary contribution. Should I read the career confession?
Yes, Patty, read it, please.
Okay. Here we go. Last presidential election year, I had some issues with my boss, and I'm starting to see them pop up again. We live in a small town, and he is the team lead of my realtor group, and his views are very largely accepted. My politics and identity do not align with his, and he knows it. He makes me uncomfortable when he is loudly and publicly professing racist and insensitive views at work. In 2020, I was early in my career, and I didn't think I could address my concerns with my boss. Since then, he has chilled out some, and the comments are much less frequent. But now that the election cycle is here, it's starting again. I've been successful in my business here, and I don't plan on leaving the team. How do I go about setting a boundary, and what's a reasonable boundary to put up?
Ooh, it's a great question.
Isn't it? I know it.
Well, if he's making racist comments at work, you probably should get fired. However,
Yeah,
Sharon,
right.
what say you?
That's unacceptable. But yeah, what say you, Sharon?
Yeah, well, I agree that there's a difference between expressing your views of like, I prefer X, Y, and Z policies and making racist, homophobic, etc. types of comments. Those are two different scenarios. So I do think the first, like the racist comments, if that's continuing to happen, that does need to be addressed because in addition to it being sort of, morally wrong, it also puts the entire company at risk.
That's right.
It's also just bad business in addition to being morally wrong.
And
so
illegal.
And illegal. That does need to be addressed. So that's let's assume that's, if that's the case, that does you do need to do something about that. But if it's just like vote for Bob because Bob's the best, like whatever it is, and it's really annoying to
You're
you.
an idiot if you don't vote for Bob.
Right, exactly. And that, it's this terrible situation where you feel like, oh, it just drives me crazy every time he brings it up. There's one method that I think has been tremendously useful when people are dealing with these sort of challenging situations, which is to articulate what your boundary is to that sort of difficult person at a time when you are not in conflict with each other. Bring it up in the moment where they're saying something and you're like, you know what? I hate it every time you say that.
Yeah,
I hate it every time you say that. And from now on, I'm going to blah, blah, blah.
Right.
That is not the time to bring it up. The time to bring it up is a time when everything's going great. And then you say it in a way that demonstrates that you care about the relationship, you care about the company, you want to continue to have a good relationship, and you love working at this company. And I just want to let you know, I am opting out of political conversations at work. And so here, like if the politics comes up, I am just going to sort of slip out the back of the holiday party. I just wanted to let you know in advance that I'm opting out of that.
Yeah.
So a boundary is articulating what you will do. It is not saying to somebody else what they have to do. And I think that's where people get hung up on boundaries. You better stop talking about politics.
Yeah, I mean, it's the trip of engagement. I totally hear you. I mean, I was involved with someone whose family, and I disagreed. I took a lot of walks during holidays. Like, boy, do I need a little fresh air. Y'all keep talking because I'm gonna go check the outside.
I'm going to go see if there's any dry rot on this deck.
Yeah. It's raining. I wonder how big the drops are. Gotta go check that sucker out. Yeah.
But what I love about your advice, and I don't think I could have given any better advice, but I love that doing it at a time that you're not in conflict.
Yes.
It's so important.
Yeah.
And, again, going to you. Not dictating to people what they have to do. You are in control of your boundaries. You are the one that sets your boundaries. And you get to say how it goes for you. And I love that. Like, I'm opting out of these conversations, just so you know. So if it comes up, I'm going to go out the back door. But I love that. And I think that was perfect advice, Sharon.
Thank you.
And we were just, I don't know, we were excited to have you. And now that we've had you on, I don't want it to end. It's just been such a fun conversation.
I know, it's gone by so fast. Oh my God.
Yeah.
I know. So where can our listeners find out more about you? Where can they buy this amazing book?
Thank you so much for asking. Yeah, you can buy The Small and the Mighty wherever you buy books. Barnes & Noble, Target, Amazon, your local bookshop, bookshop.org, all the places. You can also just go to my website, SharonMcMahon.com, and my podcast and my newsletter and all that stuff is just linked right on my website.
Okay. Gosh. Well, we just loved it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Made
fun.
my day.
Thank you. I loved this. This was great.
Thanks for listening to TruthWorks. This episode was produced and edited by Megan Hayward. Thank you to Kathleen Speckert and the whole Edit Audio team.